Thank you so much. Sorry for the delay. Apparently we demanded water and we had to have water before we started. So thank you so much for being patient with us. Good afternoon, everyone. Really excited to see so many of you at this fireside chat. My name is Taya Madupin. I am a researcher, design strategist and facilitator, and I blagged my way in here because basically I'm going to be here gently holding space for this group to start a conversation about shifting power in the context of absolute wealth. We're joined by three amazing speakers who I'll introduce in a moment, and they've been asked to just basically help us start this conversation today by opening up with some initial introductions to themselves, but also some initial reflections on this topic and this question. You are all encouraged to take part in this discussion as well. We have the Q&A feature up on the app, so please do, if you haven't, download it using the QR code on the back of your lanyard. Ask questions all the way through. I'll be keeping an eye on them, and then we'll field them all the way through as well. I think the team has also put up a word cloud, and I think the question there is power, shifting power means. So just an invitation to all of you to say a little bit about what shift in power means for you as a group. And finally, before we get started and I introduce them, I got a really nice note from them yesterday about how they wanted to hold this space, and they said they wanted to hold it in a way that models the future and the futures that they want to see, and I think that's a really beautiful intention. I hope you can all help us do that as we have this conversation today. Here we have Leticia,
yes,
Ada, and Iris. I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourselves so everyone knows who you are, and then open just with the topic. What does that mean to you? What are you holding? What do you want to bring into the space? I'll start with you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Leticia Peguero. And as far as introducing myself, I am a born and bred Nuyorican, like we say in New York. Yes, I'm okay with snaps, by the way. I've spent the past 20 or so years of my life working in philanthropy, and family philanthropy in particular, and left that during the racial uprisings in New York City for reasons that I'm happy to talk about. Not online. And so have been facilitating and working as a consultant. I'm an executive coach over the past few years, and I'm really excited to be here and to have this conversation.
I'm Ada Williams-Prince, and I am from sunny LA. And that's where I grew up, but not where I stay. I live in Seattle, Washington, which has very similar climate to London. I'm thinking about Kirsten this morning, talking about how we talk about the weather. And I have 20 years behind me, even though I still look 25. 20 years behind me of working very closely and in very close relationship with refugee women and children in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. And it's only the past decade or so that I've been working in philanthropy and investment. And so I am super happy to be here with you all. And I really thought there was only going to be like 2 rows of people here. So I'm quite pleased. And I'm super interested to see what the poll says. So I'm up to you.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Iris Nxumalo De-Smidt. I am from the west coast of South Africa. I have many identities. But I'll say politically, my identity as an African feminist informs how I move in philanthropy. It informs how I organize in my consulting practice in Lorha, Nakambe, and it also informs my PhD and how I'm thinking about organizational scholarship and the ways in which we can use it to serve liberatory praxis and practices and our commitment to freedom. And yeah, I'm really excited to have this conversation today, and thank you everyone for being here and joining us in the conversation.
Thank you, Doctor.
Amazing. So it would be good to get some opening remarks from you. So what does shifting power mean to you?
Yeah.
So I'll start, and I'm actually, as a facilitator, I'm gonna invite the audience to do a little something with me, and close your eyes if that feels comfortable. If not, you don't have to. But I'm going to ask us to imagine a child in your life. Can we? Okay. Do I want to wait?
Oh no, go ahead.
Oh.
Yeah, we can go.
I'm sorry for those who have closed their eyes. You can keep them closed.
You can.
Okay. I didn't realize this was up.
Yeah. We'll do this.
So some good words coming in. So do continue to add things to the poll. So rest, trust, dealing with grief, dancing with possibilities. Thank you for everyone who shared that. While that's up in the background, I'll invite you to...
Thank you.
continue.
Let's do
Yeah.
it. All right. So I'm going to ask you to imagine a child in your life, someone who is very young. And I'm going to imagine my baby nephew, Leo, who just turned 1 a couple of weeks ago. And think about the world that you want them to inherit. And we know, right? We know that there is incredible grief in this world, that the world is hurting. But I want you to imagine if we truly shifted power, what is that world that when Leo turns 40 or 50, what would that world look like? And how do we hold that possibility as we move through this conversation, but also the rest of the day? And hopefully it helps you reflect on what you've heard already so far, right? If your eyes are closed, open them. And I'll just say a couple of things before I pass it on to my colleagues, that for me, and for the work that I've had an opportunity to do with Ada and with others, sharing wealth and power is both a necessity, and it's also a fantasy, right? And by fantasy, I mean it's a dream, it's a concept. It doesn't make it impossible, but it is a fantasy that sort of lives outside the current racialized capitalist society that we live in today, right? Because sharing power is not incentivized. It's actually resisted, even by those of us that believe in sharing power. You can actually feel it sort of bubbling up in your stomach when you're asked to share power. And so how do we really embody sharing power? What does it mean to live into those values when everything we've been taught is that hierarchy is bad and hierarchy is good and we should not share power? And I'll just say that I am actually not opposed to hierarchy. I've been called by some of my friends in philanthropy a benevolent dictator. So clearly I am not opposed to some hierarchy. And I do believe, as Joe Freeman wrote, that there is a little bit of tyranny and structuralistness. But this idea of sharing power, I think, is really important for us to root in the idea that it's a fantasy. And I'll just say that ending slavery in the United States was also a fantasy at one point, right? It's not a perfect world by any means, but at one point it was actually a concept, an idea, a fantasy. And so to me, this question about sharing power, sharing wealth, is how do I hold both things to be true? How do I hold that it is a fantasy, a concept, that the current systems of racialized capitalism and oppression actually don't make room for? And how do I hold that it's possible? And how do I hold that I want to be part of creating the world for baby Leo and baby Chloe, who was just born into my family, and my goddaughter, right, who's 2, and only goes to you if you have chocolate cake. But, right, this idea that for the world that they're going to inherit, it requires both rooting in what is, imagining what has yet to be created, and the how. I'll just say that I think in a lot of conferences, and I always roll my eyes, I won't now when I'm asked to speak at conferences, because there's a lot of conversation that happens and there's very little how, right? How do we do this work? And there's always this sort of, this is beautiful, this is happening already, and yet there isn't a how, right? Like, how do we engage? How do we interact? How do we do this work? And I'll just end by saying that for me, and I know for my fellow panelists, that liberation, which is a very hot word in the US right now, is a practice, right? A lot of what we've heard today actually does require a practice, right? A liberatory practice is not just let's get together and have a conversation about the imagined future. It is a practice, it is a destination, and I'm really excited to talk about, and I've actually heard, I said to Ada, I'm more inspired than I have been in a long time sitting here today. This idea of how do we engage in the liberatory practice that allows us to shift power, even when we are resisting it ourselves, right? Even when I believe in hierarchy, even in philanthropy with the forever strategic plan that leads us somewhere, sometimes nowhere, many times. How do we engage in a liberatory practice that allows us to imagine and embody shifting power? And the real last thing I'll say, Ada, before I pass it on to you, is that some of the most oppressive places that I have been a part of have been organizations that we're all a part of, right? And so how do we both imagine a liberatory practice inside our organizations, not just with the grants and the PRIs and the other investment tools that we're moving out, right, to communities, but that actual liberation and shifting power starts in the organizations that we're a part of. And some of the most oppressive places I've been a part of are actually social justice organizations, which breaks my heart. And so I'm really inviting us in again to imagine the organization that baby Leo is going to work in, right? So that he feels that he's engaged in a liberatory practice, that he can think of his auntie, my auntie, she talked at a conference about shifting power. That was back then. But how do we begin to do that together? To really think about that shifting power is in the everyday.
Well, thanks.
This is why we work together, right?
So there's a couple of things you probably should know about me. One, I'm a Sagittarius and an only child. So even though we're all going to talk together, it's really about me. So I mentioned that I had worked for many years with women, refugees and children and displacement. But really what I'm trying to say is that I've always worked at the intersection of gender, power, race, and class. And I think that if you work at those intersections, what you're really saying is that it's the intersectionality, it's the layering of understanding that you're always looking for a layering of those who are at the center of marginalization, oppression. And if you're constantly doing that layering, those are the people that will get us free. Right? Those are the people that have the answer to any problem that we seek. And those are the people that believe in the future. Those are the people that are the future. And so I know we're all invested in baby Leo, but I will ask you to invest in a couple other people, which are my children, which are 14, because that's happening right now. So there's a sense of, the other thing you should know is that I have the kind of futurist and sci-fi fantasist that I am is that I said this at a dinner the other night. Like, if anybody has not seen The Three-Body Problem, it is a really important television show on Netflix because it requires us to think about both the future and the present. And when Leticia talks about the how, we're going to have a discussion about this, but it is about the practical nature of how we live in the future today. Because when you're faced with a problem like, what do we do in 400 years when the aliens are coming to get us? don't worry, it's not a spoiler, but it requires us to think differently about what choices we make, and that's what we're faced with today, right? Because it's not 400 years from now, it's happening right now. And so I think the how is really important, and for me it's about the design. And so in terms of design, we know that the systems that are currently in place are systems that were not designed for anybody on this panel, and weren't designed for most of us in the audience, and they were not designed that way because of how they came to be. But I think what we're learning is that they also weren't designed for anybody. I mean, white supremacy, patriarchy, and colonialism and capitalism is starting not to work for anyone. Yeah. So I think what we are learning about the design is how do we build better designs of the thing? I mean, this is going to be kind of crude, but I'm pretty sure that when Apple came up with the name for the iPad, there weren't many women in the room. Actually, no women at all, because I can't imagine we're all sitting around being like, yeah, let's call it the iPad. And next one, let's call the iPhone the iTampon. Like, nobody's thinking that. So, I mean, I think I'm very, very interested in design. And so one of the things that I have always done as somebody who's always thinking about the future, but the urgency of now, is what is that design? And can you build different types of design in philanthropy and investment? And I was privileged enough to be able to do that, and we could talk a little bit more about like what the practicalities of that is. But I want to also just give you an opportunity to open your mind a little bit to think about what is the design of the thing. There are so many ways that we can recapture design into a much more future way of thinking, but it can happen right now. And it might be for the future, but it can happen today. Is that my phone? No. Why would I say, is that my phone? I'm sitting right here. Anyway, I mean, it's that thing where you're like, it's my phone, but it's never my phone. But the point is, I do think about my 14-year-old, who I have nothing in common with, but everything in common with, because I have a 14-year-old boy, and we watch a lot of action movies together, because apparently that's where I'm at. Fantasy, sci-fi, that's where I'm at. That's why I asked you about the three-body problem. But there is no imagination in philanthropy and investment. We do the same things. I mean, this morning there was a lot, if you were in the session with Vinny, there's this thing about status quo. Status quo doesn't change anything. We just go back to factory settings. No matter how much we change, we go right back to factory settings. And it's because we cannot imagine a world without white supremacy, patriarchy, colonialism, right? We can if we think about 7 generations behind us, if we really tap into the indigenous wisdom, the Black African traditions, it's there, it's been there. And since we don't do that, we don't have an imagination in order to think through what that actually looks like. And so we can talk more about some of the practical ideas. And if you want to discuss the three-body problem, I will be out there. And more other sci-fi films like Black Panther or Wakanda Forever.
Yes.
Thank you. Doctor?
Thank you for speaking life into that process. I love that our conversation thus far has really emphasized the political power of dreaming and imagination and world building, because I think that's what shifting power requires. I'll start off by saying that many African feminists and decolonial activists have critiqued this idea of shifting power, right? The argument is that it's not enough, that the kinds of transformations we need are so fundamental, are so systemic, are so structural, that it's not about shifting the decks of power, right? We fundamentally need to transform how we think of power. Who is empowered? How does that power flow? And how do we use it, right? In the service of humanity, in the service of the planet, in the service of collective liberation. One of the most interesting reflections on shifting power for me personally was around this idea that part of the challenge with shifting power is we're shifting power based on the preferences of power holders, right? And we're not fundamentally transforming the trajectory of wealth accumulation and its logics. And so for many of us in the room, we hold different forms of power in different ways. And I think this critique is an invitation for us to go, what is informing our radical imaginations of change? What are they rooted in? Like, what is your base? Who is your constituency? And if we're finding it difficult to answer those questions, it is inviting us to be in community with those who are at the intersection of systems of oppression, and to deeply ask ourselves, what does that solidarity and care, what does the political commitment look like for us to be in better community and in right relationship with each other and with justice and with change? The second thing I'll say, and this is where you can tell that I'm a student in part, is I think a lot about shifting power in the context of the feminization of poverty. In philanthropy in particular, the conversations around shifting power have been about shifting resource flows. And when we think about this from a systems change perspective, we know that shifting resource flows is one strategy, right? But we also need to tackle the ideologies, the frameworks, the ideas, the attitudes, the relationships that shape who's getting funded, whose investment, whose ideas or ventures are considered worthy of investment, right? The scale of the investment. And the reason I connect this to the feminization of poverty is because oftentimes when we use that framing, we think of it in the context of individuals solely. But what you see in social justice organizing is that Black-led organizations, organizations led by women, by girls, and by trans people are chronically underfunded, right? And the Black Feminist Fund's 2023 report reflects this, right? That 0.1 to 0.35% of annual foundation giving globally goes to organizations led by Black girls, Black women, and trans folk. And then we also see this in the venture investment space, right? Where the 2019 Echoing Green report reflects that there was a 20 million USD gap between the kind of funding and investment that was given to white-led organizations vis-a-vis Black-led organizations. So we see the ways in which part of the conversation around shifting power is around shifting lack, right? It is about shifting the concentration of resources. And I think it's important for us to recognize the contradictions, right? That the same systems of oppression that have created extreme wealth are the same systems we're kind of trying to tweak and hack, right? To transform the consequences of the work of those systems. So I think it's important to hold those contradictions so that we are aware of the limitations of these approaches, and so that we can also world build on the margins of these systems where we transcend the limitations of the status quo and what is possible in our hacking and our shifting and our subverting the logics of current systems. When I think about my own forms of aspiration and joy and the world building that I see in the finance ecosystem across wealth, across philanthropy, across investment, I think there are three invitations, and I'll share just a few kind of practical examples to spotlight the ways in which these things are already happening. People are transforming power every single day, even in the context of climate crisis, even in the context of democratic decline. We see the ways in which people are transforming the logics of how we organize, how we are in right relationship with each other, and the kinds of resources that we are distributing to each other. And I think transforming power requires us to transcend lack and to really start destabilizing these colonial notions of who is the deserving poor and who is the undeserving poor, and how it then informs how resources flows, right? And a great example of this is found in cross-border resource flows. We know that in 2020, right, about 590 billion USD was shared through remittances. And this figure far exceeds overseas development assistance. It far exceeds philanthropy flows. It far exceeds private capital investment, right? And I just want to pause and say, these are people, they do not have wealth advisors.
No.
They do not have an endowment. They do not have reserves. They do not have an investment strategy. And yet, the value of all of that money moving in the absence of those things that many of us have in the structures and the institutions that we are organizing in, I think calls us to action around our generosity, around our ideas, around so-called best practice, because it is evident that in the absence of these systems and institutions, people are moving money radically every single day, and far more generously than many of our institutions and organizing spaces are. So I think it is an invitation to pause, and also an invitation to behold the power of solidarity economies. The second invitation is around a vision of radical sufficiency beyond the concentration of wealth and extractivism. And an example of world building here is in the context of movement resourcing. We did a study last year that explored funding flows in the ending violence against women and girls space in the African continent. And what was most interesting to observe is that community-grounded organizations were mostly funded by individuals in their communities. So 50% of respondents received individual giving, 29% received giving from membership dues, and then 39% received it from movement resourcing. So in a context where people often speak about money flowing from the minority world to the majority world, what we actually find is that we're resourcing our work every single day. And even if the resource flows aren't shifting to the things that we care about, to the things that transform our world, we still find a way to do it anyway. And then the last invitation I'll share is that sharing or transforming power requires sharing power by building collective power. And I love that in the context of institutional philanthropy, we see instances through the Black Feminists in Philanthropy Network and the Pan-African and Feminist Philanthropies Initiative really showing us the power of, one, building community, the power of building collective power around transforming a sector. And connecting this to some of the conversations we've had this morning around the forms of separation that extreme wealth can create, I think this sense of building collective power is one of the antidotes to that.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I just want to say two sort of tag on two important things that I think you raised for me. One is that this morning we've heard a lot of conversation about the wealth transfer, right? That's happening. That is like literally happening right now, right? The biggest in the United States, the biggest wealth transfer that the United States has ever seen. And so, when I was at a foundation, we did a bunch of work. It was a Next Generation Fund. We did a bunch of work around this. And I think one of the things that I think, actually I haven't heard said, is that the idea that it's happening. But the idea that that will automatically help us shift power is a fantasy, right? Yeah. And I think so to me, this, they go hand in hand, right? Like, there is this sort of incredible shift of wealth happening in family offices everywhere. I've worked with foundations and philanthropic actors that are really about shifting power until the next generation comes into play. And then all of a sudden, this question of legacy, right, comes into the conversation that's been gone actually for a whole part of the conversation. So I think this notion of who is worthy of risk, right? What does risk look like? I used to be in this, I called him my nemesis, but I actually loved him quite a bit. We used to have these conversations around risk, and I would always say, risk is totally made up, right? And he was an investment person. He would be like, no, risk is real, right? But to your point of how underfunded Black-led, trans-led, women-led organizations are, it's in part because we are deemed risky, that we are underfunded, right? And so this idea of risk being made up is, again, an invitation for all of us in the room. Is risk real? And some of you are going to say yes. And or is it colored by the glasses that we wear, right, depending on the isms that we exist in. You know, is risk a thing that exists as objectively as like the clothes I'm wearing, or is it something that shifts depending on who is deemed risky, who is sitting in front of me, you know, how they speak and talk and who their ancestors are or were. And so I just think it's an important sort of idea when we think about different models of shifting power, of engaging in power, that these fundamental questions of how am I participating in the resistance to shifting power be part of the conversation, so that it isn't just an external reality, but it's actually an internal process that all of us are a part of, including those of us that come from you know, historically oppressed communities.
And I think to your point, when you talk about risk, you can't talk about risk without talking about trust and who do we trust. And so the remittances, I think, is a branding issue, because it's actually trillions of dollars that are going in remittances every year. And it's who is deemed, it's what you said, who is deemed generous. Because if you happen to be an extreme wealth holder who happens to be white, that's generosity. But if you're sending trillions of dollars in remittances and you happen to be not that, then it's just what you do to send money home. That's just your community, that's just what you do. But what if, you know, that's trillions of dollars, that's more than philanthropy. But if you happen to be a family that is doing philanthropy, you know, so it's a branding issue and it's a trust issue. So if you're talking about risk, you have to talk about trust. And if you're talking about trust, then it is about, like, what does it mean to shift and share power if you don't trust? I mean, banking is all about trust, right? So how do you see the world through trust? Because if we're talking about wealth, we're talking about trust, and if we don't trust communities, because if we don't trust communities, then how can we share power with them? So for me, I think I'm going back to the design issue. I'm not going to talk about the three-body problem. I'm going to the design issue. So you and I had an opportunity to serve on a design council of women and girls of color, where we were able to design an investment strategy worth multi-million dollars to then build an actual strategy by us, for us, women and girls of color in the United States and globally. One of the grantees was the Black Feminist Fund, which then went on to do Black feminism in philanthropy and you know, had their big all the work that they've been doing so far. But I think the only way that could happen is because we started with trusting a group of women and girls of color to build an investment strategy. So that took trust and that took collective power. That was sharing power from, you know, a private family foundation had to bring the outside in. So there's trust. And then it was like, as a group, when you talk about practice, it was a group of people who spent years, well, okay, it was, I'm exaggerating.
There are lots of calls. It was years.
It was a practice. It was a practice. Building the strategy and then distributing that wealth, you know, outward. And then it was, you know, it was cohorts. It was a model that had evaluation as a tool for liberation. Like, it was a whole way of being. It wasn't just like, everybody get together and give out the money. It was a whole way of being.
But, you know, Ada, I think, and this touches, I think, on something that you said, that part of the reason that it worked, and I think it worked. We actually, you know, it was sort of, it's very emotional for me because it was such, you started this design during a time, it was COVID. Right, and so we were isolated in our homes, but it was people from around, you know, the country in very different industries. But the fundamental truth there was that we all believed in liberatory practice. Maybe we didn't call it that, right? But we all believed that something was really wrong, and we needed to shift power, and we needed to move this money, and we were going to do it. We didn't always agree. Oftentimes we did not. But we were going to do it, and we were going to practice, and we were going to get back together. We were going to get back on the Zoom, and we were going to do the thing because we fundamentally believed in the liberation of Black women and girls, right? And I feel like, to me, this fundamental thing of like, what is the belief that undergirds, right? This, sometimes these frameworks that we come up with in the sector, which have very lovely names, you know, that don't lead us to change is, to some extent, that we haven't asked the question, what is the belief system, right? Something that you said, Iris, what is the belief system that's informing this work? Which I think is, you know, we in the Design Council, we didn't have that issue because we all believed that we were working for the liberation of Black and brown women and femmes, right? And it was just sort of a given, right? We were sort of there, we believed it. You know, maybe I believed a little bit this, and someone else had, I don't know, when Leticia says this, she's wrong. But it was said with love and care. And so I think that, to me, this question of like, what are the fundamental beliefs that undergird the design, that undergird the call for a shift in power? Like, do you really believe in transforming the world? Or is this about transforming the strategy until 5 years from now that we do another strategic plan? Right? Those are different calls to action. And so I encourage us and I invite us to use your model, but also to really question, right? Like, what did you say, Iris? What is informing, right, the way that we're sort of engaging in this work? Because if not, we're just kind of recreating systems, right?
Factory settings. Like a rubber band, factory settings.
So we've got, this has been a beautiful conversation so far, and we've got some questions from the audience, so I want to honour that and leave us some time
Who said
to...
we were taking questions?
Okay, so I think I heard some energy where we want to get into some practicality. So we want to start hearing about some of the things that we can actually be doing. We've already talked about some, but some more things that we can actually be doing to change. So there's a question from Apolline Roger, which is, it's a fascinating point about design. Everything has been designed and can be designed differently. Can you say more about a design that has helped establish liberating practice and why? So we've already seen some, but any others? Maybe Iris, you wanna share?
I'm going to answer this in a roundabout way, but speak about the idea of design rights. Like, who has the right to design the systems, the policies, the structures that shape how resources flow, that shape our lives, that shape how we organize?
Everyone.
Yeah, but the reality of the situation across the finance ecosystem, so across wealth management, philanthropy, investment, is that there's a select few of us making those decisions, often without consultation with the people whom it will impact the most.
Exactly.
And so I think part of how we really leverage design as a part of liberatory praxis is around democratizing design rights and ensuring that the people we claim to serve, especially in the context of philanthropy or the planets, the commitments that we've made towards social justice, towards human rights, that people who are most impacted by our decisions, by our organizing, are the ones who are informing the ways in which our investments, our philanthropic strategies, right? Our wealth management strategies are structured, informed, and executed.
Exactly. That's exactly what the Design Council is about, is who gets the right to design. Another example is, oftentimes I think we use investment, capital investment as a way of saying, well, no, it's too complicated to do it with investment. Like, no, it's different, it's finance. So, woof, no. But it actually is possible with investment. There is a group called the Grantmakers for Girls of Color. They built something called the Future Economy Lab with another group called Second Muse. And they actually built investment vehicles that were designed by girls of color. And so it is possible. It is possible. There's nothing in terms of design rights, in terms of who gets to design things. It is possible in all the ways. It takes time. It takes commitment to being able to want to do it.
Sure. Amazing. We've got more questions. One of the things that we've seen is that there are some really good things happening, women and girls, non-binary folk, maybe things in the global south. How do we, there's a question from Dr. Gillian Marcel, this is specifically about the point on remittances in Central to see change happening now. How can formal philanthropic spaces learn from these types of developments, but critically without cannibalizing these efforts?
Thank you, Doctor.
Can I take a first attempt at it?
Yes, Doctor.
I think I want to caveat and say that I see remittances or everyday giving as a form of horizontal philanthropy. And I think there's a lot we can learn from it without romanticizing it as well. Because often when we speak about horizontal philanthropy, especially in the context of institutionalized philanthropy, then we end up getting quite romantic about individual giving. What I will say though is, for me, there are some key tenets and values around horizontal philanthropies that are valuable across the finance ecosystem. I think one, the idea around interdependence, right? Secondly, the fact that me, for example, resourcing you in a moment of need doesn't mark you as a grantee your whole life. And that there is another moment in time where you will resource my survival, you will resource my care, you will resource my flourishing, and there's interdependence in that. Oftentimes in the finance ecosystem, we create very set in stone identities around who is giving and who is receiving in a way that solidifies the power asymmetries that we are trying to transform.
Exactly.
I think there's also something quite critical about the forms of solidarity that we see in the context of everyday giving. We know that a lot of our everyday giving also resources social justice, but a lot of it is also about resourcing our collective care. So I think also moving beyond the work for my money, kind of paradigm oftentimes of like philanthropy, of investment, like you need to do X, Y, and Z for you to be worthy of receiving this, and really seeing it as this reparative justice approach of I really want to resource your flourishing. What does it look like to resource the liberation and the care and the flourishing of people across the world, of movements? What does it look like to resource beyond the performance that often happens in the finance ecosystem? What does it look like to truly release and to enable these resources to flow outside of the performance of this is why I am worthy to receive these particular forms of financing?
And I'll say that I think to some extent this is a narrative challenge, right? Who holds the power to shape our narratives?
Yeah.
And so there is like the doing of the thing, and then there is a story that gets told about the doing. And the sort of romantic, bless you, salud. The telling of the story that oftentimes is quite unjust and doesn't tell the full picture of what is the thing, right? A dear colleague that many of you in this audience know, Mandy Van Dieven, who does narrative justice work, is oftentimes talking about who is the storyteller, and then who gets to shape that story, and who are the actors, right, in that story. And I think the remittance question is both a thing that's happening, and it's this story that gets told that we actually inherit and believe that it's very different from philanthropy as we know it. And so I do think this question, and just to say something that the questioner asked, how does it not get cannibalized, I think the word was. Philanthropy by its nature is going to cannibalize the thing, right? And so I think this question is one of again, it's a shifting power question. Who gets to design? Who gets to tell the story? But also, how do we understand the sort of system that we're working in and know that the system itself, like, this is a thing that the system does, right? Like, and so if this is a thing that the system does, what are the tools that I must use day in and day out to disrupt? Right? You know, I have a Buddhist practice, and one of the things you learn very quickly is your mind thinks thoughts. Fighting against it, it's a fool's endeavor, right? So it isn't about fighting against the thoughts. It's actually, how do I understand the structure within which I'm working in? Philanthropy will cannibalize, and yet, how do we find the tools to sort of disrupt the status quo, which is available to us, I think.
Yep. Amazing. I feel like we're going to wind down at the moment, but to do that, I just wanted to pose a... Shall we stay? We'll just stay. It's great. I wanted to... there was a question that I think has been posed by everyone, all of the panels today, and actually someone's asked it here, and it's... I'm going to do a hybrid. So Debbie Clark has asked what examples do you have of joy in sharing wealth and power. So I'm just going to ask you what hope do you have and what examples of joy do you see?
Debbie Clark.
Oh, there she is.
All right,
Debbie.
You know, I texted a friend during the last panel who's watching, actually. Hi, who is in New York and has been doing this type of work for, you know, a long, long time. And I texted her and I said, I am more inspired than I have been in a long time sitting here today. And I think that's to some extent that gives me hope because I've been exhausted by the conversations in U.S. philanthropy over the past few years, where it's there's a lot of performance that's happening, and there's a lot of the conversations are the same. Oh my God, my feed is so boring, y'all. Like, it is the same conversation. You go to the conferences and people will be like, I'm like, how are we still talking about this, right? And here, actually, the conversations have been slightly different. And so that gives me hope. And joy, you know, I love to dance, y'all. And I invite you all to do the somatic thing. Whatever that is, you can come dance with me. I know where there's a good salsa club all over the world, so including here. So, you know, I think, you know, how do we stay joyous, right, while the world is literally burning? Because that is, to some extent, right, what's going to help us shift power.
See, now, that's why I don't like following you. I've known her for years. You'd think I would know better by now. So on the hope side, I really believe in us. I believe in, I believe in the future, and I believe there is liberation today and in the future, because I'm obsessed with sci-fi things, and futuristic movies. And I honestly can say that I have seen the times where I've worked in communities that have been places where people have written things off. You know, I've worked in places where people have written everything about these communities off, and it is just not possible to do that. And so I get such deep joy from working in communities with others, and I know it's possible, even though working in philanthropy and investment in this kind of wealth can sometimes be a very political project, because it is not for our thriving. It is not for our thriving. And so for me, as a Black woman in this particular industry that I did not want to go into, it takes a lot to continue under such conditions.
Okay.
And it is the joy that I feel because of the people who are with me in this. And that means all of you, so you have to help me continue. And that's really it. It's because Leticia keeps me strong. Only because she'll invite me to a salsa club.
Do you want to wrap us up?
Yes, I'll share an example from my consulting practice because I believe systems are fractal. So what happens at a small scale can set the stage for what can happen in larger systems. One of the joys of sharing power and wealth has been two parts, right? One, through the practice of pay equity in my consulting practice. So all of us have different years of experience and educational levels, and we decided that we want to remunerate each other the same. So whether it's your first year in the consulting practice or you've been in the field for 10 years, we all have the same daily rate. And I think the joy of that is we don't have to operate in secrecy and try and remember, oh, this one gets paid this one gets paid this, and put a clause in a contract around confidentiality around payment, because everyone gets paid the same and it's clear what the daily rate is. And when we are talking with co-dreamers, when we are negotiating work, we can do so from a place of freedom, because I'm not like, oh, we have a range, and trying to be vague because we have different practices, but we can really share wealth in a way that affirms the dignity and the value of everyone's work, regardless of the kind of work you do, regardless of the role you play, regardless of the level of education you have, and regardless of the years of experience you have.
Fantastic.
And I want to say that this is informed by feminist praxis, right? We've seen in organizations, feminists do this, and a range of other practices around equity in pay. I've loved personally power sharing as a leader. I've often heard that leadership is lonely and an isolating experience. I've found that through adopting feminist principles of leadership, where we're sharing power, we're sharing decision making, that leadership is collective practice. And so I don't feel isolated. I don't feel alone, because we're all sitting and thinking about, okay, this is the situation, this is how we're going to navigate it. And I think for me, those two examples really highlight like the joy of transformative praxis, because instead of doing all of these extra things that make us exhausted and we don't like them, we can operate in freedom and boldness and wholeness, because we're really operating aligned to our values, and we can partner with people who align and resource those values as well.
Awesome. Amazing.